In just a few minutes, a fast Russian assault force was wiped out in open ground before it could even reach the Ukrainian trench line. Approximately 17 Russian troops on motorcycles raced across no man's land, trying to cross the danger zone before Ukrainian drones could lock on. Instead, the entire attack collapsed in fire, smoke, and confusion almost as quickly as it began. Welcome to Strategic Horizon, where we dissect the evolving tactics of modern warfare. But the true revelation lies deeper. This attack was compromised long before the first explosion even occurred. Danger no longer waits only in mines, artillery, or hidden infantry positions. It now follows movement from above, tracks heat, watches routes, and strikes the moment a unit becomes most exposed. This is a prime example of how Ukraine is transforming drones into a sophisticated, layered hunting system. A strike group can now be seen from far away, followed as it accelerates, split apart under pressure, and destroyed just before it reaches the point of impact. The deeper story isn't merely that motorcycles failed where armored vehicles have also struggled. It's about why a tactic fundamentally built on speed, surprise, and precise timing can now unravel so completely. This leads to a critical question. If speed alone is no longer sufficient to survive the crossing, what options remain for Russian forces attempting to approach Ukrainian trenches? This assault did not begin as a reckless burst of speed, but as a calculated attempt to solve a battlefield problem that has become harder for Russian forces with every passing month. Heavy armored vehicles can still bring men forward, but they also draw fire, attract drones, and struggle across broken ground already torn apart by shells, craters, and failed attacks. This is precisely why this particular push began with motorcycles. They weren't selected for their strength, but for their speed, narrow profile, and the challenge they posed the targeting in the initial moments of movement. Approximately 17 Russian troops were dispatched on bikes as a compact assault group, their mission brutally simple. Their objective wasn't to engage in a protracted open field battle. Instead, they aimed to reach the trench line, dismount, assault the position, and create sufficient disruption to allow a subsequent wave to advance behind them. In that kind of attack, every second matters because the unit survives only as long as its speed stays ahead of the enemy's targeting cycle. The route traversed damaged earth, scarred by artillery and previous traffic, with loose dirt, shell holes, and uneven patches ready to unbalance any rider who lost focus for even a moment. A heavy troop carrier would have crossed that space more slowly and with far more noise. A motorcycle could slip through faster, cut across rough lanes, and reduce the time spent in the most dangerous zone. The formation reflected this logic from the outset. The riders didn't bunch together in a tight mass, as that would have made them an easy target for a single strike. Instead, they spread out along the direction of advance, maintaining sufficient distance between bikes to minimize the chance of one explosion devastating the entire group. The attack depended on that spacing because distance between riders was one of the few forms of protection they had left. Yet, the inherent weakness of the plan was evident from that very moment. While a motorcycle can transport a soldier swiftly, it offers no protection from blast fragments or a diving drone. It cannot absorb punishment like heavier armor, and it leaves the rider with minimal room for recovery once panic sets into the formation. The group needed to remain fast, controlled, and undetected long enough to reach the trench before the surrounding battlefield could react. So, the men pressed on, engines roaring louder as they entered the exposed ground. The attack initially appeared exactly as designed, sudden, narrow, and seemingly difficult to halt in its opening seconds. But that impression was deceptive. The true danger wasn't lurking at the trench line ahead, it was already materializing from a distance. The most critical moment in this assault wasn't when the riders would confront Ukrainian infantry, but the instant they became visible in terrain that only seemed empty. The attack's dynamic shifted the moment Ukraine spotted it, because speed is only an advantage until someone begins tracking movement in real time. As the Russian riders pushed harder across the open ground, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones were already observing their approach routes from a distance. What appeared on the screens below was not a large armored column or a slow convoy requiring time for identification. The assault registered as a line of fast-moving heat signatures cutting across the cold terrain just before dawn. That image alone was sufficient to inform Ukrainian operators that this was no routine movement. It was a strike force attempting to reach the trench line before defenses could fully consolidate. That was the moment the entire logic of the engagement shifted. Up to that point, the Russian plan still depended on surprise, even if only for a short window. Once the riders were spotted, that window began to close almost immediately. The open strip ahead was no longer merely ground to be crossed. It transformed into a monitored corridor, and every meter the motorcycles covered now drew them deeper into a space where their direction, spacing, and pace could be meticulously tracked from above. Ukraine did not wait for the group to get close enough for infantry at the trench to deal with it. A team of FPV drones was sent out from behind the line to meet the riders before they could reach the last and most dangerous stage of the approach. The Russian troops remained focused forward, still racing against time, but another force was already converging on them from a different layer of the battlefield. One side raced toward a position, the other raced to dismantle that advance before it could arrive. As the motorcycles kept pushing on, the ground itself began to interfere with the attack. One rider in the rear section hit the broken edge of an old shell crater at speed, and the bike jolted hard enough to force a sharp correction. That brief loss of rhythm didn't halt the assault, but it disrupted the cohesive pattern that had held the group together. A few riders adjusted to the wobble, some narrowed their spacing, while others drifted slightly off course before regaining their position in the advance. The disruption lasted only seconds, yet, in an attack built on timing and shape, seconds were enough to matter. From above, that brief disturbance made the group easier to interpret. While a formation that begins stretched and controlled can still pose a challenge to an incoming strike due to the ordered movement of each rider, this is precisely when the distinction between a fast assault and a vulnerable one begins to emerge. Ukraine no longer faced a clean arrow moving toward the trench. It was now observing a target that had already begun to lose its perfect flow. From that point on, the clash stopped being a simple ground raid and became a layered pursuit. The Russian unit still had to keep moving because slowing down would only make the danger worse. The next phase of the clash began when Ukrainian FPV teams noticed that one motorcycle in the Russian group was distinct from the others. As the drones closed in and the image on the screens sharpened, one bike revealed additional equipment mounted behind the rider, an electronic warfare jammer. This instantly altered the entire dynamic of the pursuit. That machine was crucial because it could interfere with the final seconds of a drone attack, often the most critical moments of all. A jammer can disrupt the video link, distort the signal, or delay control long enough to throw a strike off target. On open ground, where there is virtually no real cover, even a subtle electronic shield can be the difference between a direct hit and a miss. Consequently, the motorcycle carrying the jammer immediately became the most critical target within the entire formation. From that point, the Ukrainian drones were no longer simply chasing a moving column. They began operating with a clearer purpose. Some stayed close enough to maintain visual contact and keep the group under pressure, while others adjusted their angles and speed to be in position for the order to strike the jammer first. The Russian riders were still driving hard toward the trench line, but the center of gravity of the battle had already shifted. It was no longer just about stopping the assault, it was about removing the one piece of equipment that could still give that assault a path through the danger. Simultaneously, another layer of the battlefield began to activate behind the Russian formation. As the incoming drones moved beyond the terrain's folds and became more noticeable, the Russian air defense network entered the fray. A radar station, positioned not far from the assault route, powered on and began sweeping the sky behind the moving column. Its operators didn't yet have a complete picture, but they could already discern multiple fast targets pushing into the area from low altitude. Until then, the FPV drones had maintained a low profile, approaching from uneven angles and utilizing the terrain itself to minimize early detection. This made the approach dangerous, yet manageable for the Ukrainian side. However, once they climbed or crossed into clearer viewing space, the risk profile shifted dramatically. The signs first appeared on the Ukrainian operator screens. The image, previously tense but readable, began to flicker. Static lines cut across the picture, shapes blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. The motorcycles remained visible but unstable. The video feed started to pulse with interference as Russian electronic warfare pushed back against the drones, now entering their final approach. This pressure fell directly on the Ukrainian crews controlling the drones. They now had to maintain focus while the image disintegrated before them. Thus, the engagement entered its most fragile stage. Russia still had a moving assault force, and its electronic warfare was beginning to interfere at precisely the right moment. Ukraine still had drones within striking range, but the window for a clean attack was rapidly narrowing. The next moments would decide whether the jammer remained alive long enough to shield the column, or whether the Ukrainian teams would take the risk and dive before the screen went dark. By this stage, the Russian electronic warfare screen was performing exactly as intended, and the Ukrainian FPV teams were now battling the signal as much as they were battling the assault itself. The picture on several screens kept breaking apart into blur, static, and sudden jumps in position. Shapes that were clear one second became smeared shadows the next. The motorcycles were still there, still moving, but the approach had turned into a race against blindness. If the interference persisted for just a little longer, some drones would lose the crucial final guidance they needed, and the entire interception could collapse at the last moment. This is why the Ukrainian operators made the most dangerous choice available. A few drones had already closed the distance sufficiently to attempt a strike, and waiting for a clearer picture was no longer a realistic option. The crews understood that any delay could allow the jammer bike to survive, the rest of the formation to break through, and the signal to disappear completely. So, instead of backing off, they took the risk and committed early. The order was not to spread the attack across the whole group. The order was to hit the motorcycle carrying the jammer before the screen went dark. The dive was swift. One FPV drone plunged from the noisy sky, corrected once through a field of flickering interference, and then drove straight toward the bike, identified as the key to the Russian defense. The rider was still moving with the rest of the group, attempting to maintain pace with the push toward the trench line, when the drone came in low and hard. A single flash followed, then a sharp burst of fire and fragments. The jammer bike was instantly torn apart, and the machine that had been disrupting the final approach was suddenly eliminated from the battlefield. That strike almost immediately altered the aerial picture. The pressure on the remaining drones began to ease as the primary source of interference within the moving formation had been eliminated. The screens didn't become perfectly clear, yet the image stabilized sufficiently for operators to regain control with greater confidence. They could now track targets more precisely, refine their approach later, and press the surviving drones deeper into the attack without constant guesswork. The Russian group had lost the sole moving shield that had offered it a chance to survive the crossing. The Russian riders immediately understood that something had gone terribly wrong. The blast in the middle of the group shattered what remained of their assault rhythm, and several men abandoned the original plan almost instantly. Some abandoned their motorcycles where they stopped and ran toward a nearby tree line, hoping the woods would provide cover from the drones. Others continued riding, attempting to outrun the danger before another drone could strike. A few machines were left upright or half fallen in the dirt, engines still running beside the track as their riders fled on foot. The Ukrainian drones swiftly split their attention. One chased men running for the forest edge, striking just before they reached the first substantial cover. Another pursued a motorcycle still moving alone, hitting it on its retreat route and turning the bike into a burning wreck on open ground. A third focused on the abandoned vehicles, using them as fixed targets after the riders had scattered. In a short span, the assault ceased resembling a coordinated push and began to look like a fractured force desperately trying to survive. The battle didn't end with the jammer bike's explosion. The destruction of that single vehicle created a secondary emergency for the Russian side almost immediately. The radar and electronic warfare position behind the assault route could now see that the motorcycle push had lost its protective core and was disintegrating in open ground. Signals were sent from the rear, and requests for support were relayed to forces deeper behind the line, including the troops positioned near the trench area intended to receive the assault. That response introduced a new threat. A small relief group of tanks and armored personnel carriers was ordered forward to reach the damaged assault lane, recover any surviving troops, and prevent the collapse from escalating into a total battlefield loss. If those heavier vehicles could reach the area in time, they might pull survivors out of the kill zone, add firepower to the fight, and still create pressure on the Ukrainian trench line. However, the rescue attempt didn't remain hidden for long. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, already monitoring the wider area, detected movement behind the Russian line and identified fresh vehicles advancing. The warning quickly reached the drone teams. The problem was no longer limited to the men scattered across the open ground and the forest edge. Another force was now in motion, capable of altering the situation if it arrived before Ukraine could react again. Meanwhile, the Russian soldiers who had abandoned their motorcycles were desperately trying to survive on foot. Some reached the first trees and turned to fire upward through the branches, hoping rifle fire might deter the drones long enough to regroup. That effort proved futile. One drone followed two men as they ran between the trunks, striking just after one of them paused to aim into the sky. Another tracked a soldier who threw himself behind a tree and then attempted to sprint to a second position, but was hit before he could reach it. The woods offered concealment, but not safety, and the men who had abandoned their bikes now discovered that the drones were pursuing them even into the cover they had hoped would save them. The greater danger, however, was the relief column still pushing forward. Ukraine understood that if these tanks and armored vehicles reached the broken assault zone, they could potentially continue the mission toward the trench line. This realization immediately triggered a request for more drone launches. Fresh FPV teams were brought into the fight, and reconnaissance units maintained continuous watch over the rescue convoy as it drew closer. The interception began before the relief force could fully deploy. One armored vehicle at the front was hit near the route into the damaged area, stopping at an angle and partially blocking the lane behind it. A second strike hit another vehicle attempting to maneuver around the first, forcing its crew to halt before entering the most dangerous stretch. Then, a drone plunged onto a tank that had continued forward despite the initial explosions, hitting it precisely enough to stop its advance and plunge the rest of the group into hesitation. That hesitation became the final undoing of the rescue attempt. Some Russian vehicles remained in place, while others began turning around rather than proceeding into the drone-covered zone. The column wasn't fully destroyed, but it had been stopped, fractured, and repelled before it could rescue the men ahead. By the end of this phase, the failed motorcycle assault had escalated into something even more serious for Russia. What stands out most in this battle isn't a single explosion or a single failed rush, but the systematic way the entire assault was dismantled, layer by layer, before it ever reached the Ukrainian trench line. The Russian side traded armor for speed, sending troops forward on motorcycles, hoping that a swift push across open ground would succeed where heavier vehicles had struggled. Ukraine responded with a fundamentally different approach. It employed detection, tracking, overhead pressure, and a coordinated strike sequence that effectively transformed movement itself into a trap. That is the profound message of this clash. Almost any exposed movement can now be detected, tracked, and attacked within minutes. It vividly demonstrates how modern warfare is evolving at the lowest tactical level. The larger question now is, what comes next? If motorcycles are fast but too exposed, and armored vehicles are stronger but easier to detect, then what kind of assault can still traverse open ground under constant drone pressure? We might see more sophisticated electronic warfare, more elaborate deception tactics, or smaller units attempting new routes and timing. In the next rounds of fighting, will speed remain an advantage, or is it increasingly making assault groups easier to spot and destroy? If you found this breakdown insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Strategic Horizon for more in-depth battlefield analysis.